Evening, friends. I'm Beau LeClair, and this here's the Dixie Tales, where the Deep South still whispers if you listen close. These are the stories that never made the history books, but live on in the heat, the dust, and the hush between crickets. So pull up a chair, tap that like, and subscribe if you believe some truths are too wild to stay buried. Now, let's begin. Come on in close now, friends. Settle yourself like you would on a porch swing when the evening settles warm around your shoulders and the crickets start their chorus. Nights like this are meant for the kind of stories that don't sit quiet in the dark. Stories that breathe a little heavier than the truth and a little deeper than the lies. I've always said the South carries two kinds of tales, the ones we tell to remember, and the ones we tell because forgetting them would be a sin. This here is one of the latter, a story that shook loose from a single moment of violence and rolled its way through time until it turned into something bigger, darker, and louder than the man who started it. Every generation thinks they discovered Stagger Lee. They hear the song, tap their foot to the rhythm, feel the danger tucked inside the melody, and figure they've stumbled across some outlaw conjured up by bluesmen with more whiskey than sense. But long before the song, long before the recordings, and long before the legend grew claws and horns, there stood a real man made of flesh, ambition, and a kind of pride that could cut a room in half. His name was Lee Shelton, and if you'd been walking the streets of St. Louis back in the 1890s, you would have seen him coming long before you heard him. Now, before we step into the night that changed history, you've got to picture St. Louis the way it used to be. It wasn't the polished archway city folks know today. It was a river-bent beast made of brick soot, muddy roads, gas lamps, and the constant churn of people drifting north, south, and sideways looking for work, trouble, or a place to disappear. Winter rolled in like a dark coat, heavy with fog off the Mississippi. Wood stoves smoked through thin roofs. Horses stamped steam into the air. Men crowded into saloons because warmth was a luxury and whiskey was a cheaper one. Every city has its corners where stories take root, and in St. Louis it was the saloons where everything interesting happened. These weren't quiet establishments. They were thick with cigar haze, the smell of spilled beer, men arguing over dominoes, women leaning against bar counters with a knowing eye, and the low hum of blues before the blues even had a name. It wasn't a place for the meek or the unlucky, and people who walked through those swinging doors understood that a man's pride could turn the whole room violent before the barkeep could blink, and that's where the legend began. It was the night of December 24th, 1895, Christmas Eve. Folks were trying to wrap their worries in merriment, trying to find joy at the bottom of bottles or in the warmth of cheap rooms. But not every man brings goodwill into a holiday. Some bring unresolved grudges, bruised egos, debts, and tempers waiting for the slightest spark. That evening, in a saloon off 11th Street, two men stepped into each other's path in a way that would echo farther and longer than either of them ever lived to see. The first was Billy Lyons, a man who walked that thin line between respectable and restless. He had a job, a family, and a reputation for being a man who didn't pick fights but didn't mind finishing them. The second man was Lee Shelton, known in some circles as Stag Lee, a name whispered with a mix of admiration and caution. There's something fascinating about a man who walks into a room looking like the world owes him a debt. That was Shelton. He wore fine clothes, fine hats, and kept his boots shined like mirrors. He didn't move fast, but people moved fast around him. A saloon could be bustling loud one moment, and a low hush would slide in the second Stag pushed through the door. Some men get fear by force, others earn it by presence. Stag was the latter. He walked like a lesson other men hoped never to learn. On that Christmas Eve, fate didn't stroll in off the river. It walked in wearing a Stetson hat and a heavy coat, smelling faintly of hair tonic, river cold, and something sharper beneath. Billy Lyons was already inside the saloon, warming his hands around a glass of whiskey and trying to take the edge off the winter and the year behind him. Nobody could have predicted that within an hour, one of these men would be dead and the other one's name would become immortal. But tragedies don't come with warning labels. They come quiet, subtle, wrapped in normal moments until they split open. The two men knew each other well enough. Maybe they weren't enemies that day. Maybe they weren't friends either. But they were both men of their era, men who guarded their pride like it was the last clean shirt they owned. And back then, in a world that didn't offer black men much more than hardship and hollered insults, pride was one of the only things they truly possessed. That's something folks forget when they hear the song. They think this story's about a hat, but the hat was just the fuse. What exploded that night was everything unspoken between two men balancing their dignity against a world trying to strip it from them. As the night wore on, the saloon filled with laughter, card shuffling, the slide of coins, and the buzz of holiday spirits. But somewhere between the drinks and the ruckus, words were exchanged, words that poked at the tender places men try to hide. Pride collided with ego. Each drink sharpened the tension. And then came the moment that historians, musicians, and drifters have all circled back to again and again. Billy Lyons reached out and snatched Stag's hat. Now you might hear that and shrug, but you've got to remember what a hat meant in those days. A man's hat wasn't just cloth and brim. It was his symbol, his bearing, his reputation sitting right there on his head. Touching another man's hat was crossing a line deeper than an insult. It was stepping on his honor. Stag demanded it back. Billy refused. Maybe he was drunk. Maybe he thought he was being playful. Maybe he wanted to prove something in front of the other men. But whatever the reason, the refusal took the moment from heated to deadly in a single heartbeat. Up to that point, it was the kind of holiday squabble saloon owners saw 100 times a year. But when two men carry matching amounts of stubbornness and wounded pride, the room turns dangerous in a way that even the walls seem to recognize. Every man nearby felt the shift, that subtle tightening in the air. Some turned away to avoid choosing a side. Others watched with the stillness of men who know the final act is coming, whether anyone wants it or not. In a world where the law didn't always care to protect men like Stag or Billy, respect became its own kind of currency. And once it was torn, violence wasn't far behind. You could argue that the devil himself climbed atop that bar counter, swung his legs over the edge, and waited to see what kind of story he'd carry out of that saloon. What happened next wasn't sung sweet or slow in the earliest versions of the ballad. It didn't have a guitar lick or a steady drum behind it. It was sudden, stark, and final. But we ain't there yet. Because before that fatal moment, before the sound that split the night, the world paused in a way only dark stories know how to do. A pause that feels like the last deep breath before a storm rips the sky apart. And inside that breath, inside that inch of stillness, the legend of Stagger Lee was waiting to be born. So take a breath with me. Let the cold of that night settle in your bones. Picture the lamps burning low, the whiskey half finished, the tension drawing itself tight like a rope about to snap. Because when the next part comes, it comes fast, and it comes forever. Ease on in closer, folks, because before we step into the gunsmoke of that Christmas Eve, we've got to understand the man who walked into that saloon wearing a hat that would soon become the most famous piece of headgear in American music history. Stories don't grow teeth unless the man at the center of them already had a bite, and Lee Shelton was no ordinary figure wandering the streets of St. Louis. You can't call him a hero, and you sure can't call him a simple villain. Men like him live somewhere in that murky space between respect and fear, between charm and danger, and the South has always produced that kind of man in heavy supply. Now, when folks hear the name Stagger Lee these days, they picture a gunslinging, devil-grinning outlaw conjured up by the oldest bluesman who ever walked a dusty Mississippi road. They picture a man cursed with fire in his veins and wickedness in his smile. But the truth is far more interesting than the myth. Long before he became a legend, long before his story grew claws and horns and a rhythm behind it, he was simply Lee Shelton, born in the tangled aftermath of the Civil War and raised in a world where a man had to carve his own space or be swallowed whole. If you want to understand him, you've got to picture the St. Louis he grew up in. The Mississippi River didn't just carry water past those docks, it carried gamblers, hustlers, traveling musicians, wounded spirits, and the constant shuffling footsteps of a people trying to rebuild themselves in a country that still didn't know what freedom truly meant. The neighborhoods were rough, loud, and alive with both opportunity and danger. Barbershops buzzed with gossip, gambling halls clattered with dice. Street vendors pushed carts of roasted peanuts beside brothels lit with soft red lamps. And everywhere you walked, you felt the current of something bigger than the city itself. Ambition, hunger, pride. That was the soil that grew Lee Shelton. He was born in Mississippi, but like many after the war, his family moved north in search of something better, something steadier, something with a little more promise than the broken fields of the South could offer. St. Louis wasn't heaven and it wasn't hell. It was a place where a man could make something of himself if his back was strong and his will was stronger. Lee was tall, broad-shouldered, handsome in the way that gets a man noticed across a room. He learned early that presentation mattered. He kept his clothes pressed, his boots shined, and wore hats that cost more than some men's weekly wages. He spoke with a low, deliberate voice, rarely raising it but somehow always making men listen. He wasn't a brute, but he wasn't gentle either. He had that rare ability to make himself the center of any room he walked into, and in those days, charisma was worth its weight in gold. But don't go thinking Lee Shelton was some fancy gentleman untouched by the grit of the streets. He worked his way into leadership in the 400 Club, a political and social network of black men who operated in the shadows of city politics. They were fixers, hustlers, businessmen, gamblers, pimps, ward bosses, men who could turn a neighborhood election with a handful of promises and a few threats whispered in the right ears. Lee fit right in. He wasn't running brothels out of desperation or crime for necessity. He ran them because it was profitable and because it gave him a seat at the table among the men who controlled vice, commerce, and influence in the black districts of St. Louis. His reputation wasn't built on brutality like some men who held that line of work. It was built on order, on confidence, on the kind of unspoken rules that kept his businesses smooth and his pockets lined. To many in the community, he was a symbol of black autonomy, a man who refused to bow his head in a society still stacked against him. To others, he was a dangerous figure, unpredictable, sharp-edged, and always calculating. But whichever side of him you chose to see, you couldn't ignore the fact that he moved with purpose and owned every inch of ground he walked on. Men like him don't explode in a moment of violence without years of pressure building beneath the surface. And the truth is this: Lee Shelton lived in a world where respect wasn't a luxury. It was survival. And when you've climbed the ladder of influence rung by rung, when you've scraped out your dignity in the shadows of a society eager to strip it away, you protect it with everything you have. That's how a man becomes Stag Lee. The nickname didn't come from murder. It didn't come from song. It came from the stag-topped hat he wore, a proud, bold, expensive statement in a world where most men were grateful for any hat at all. They called him Stag because he strutted like a man who belonged to himself and nobody else. They called him Stag because he moved through rooms with the slow confidence of an animal that knows other beasts will get out of its way. People forget that Stag Lee was famous before the murder. Not the global kind of famous he became later, but famous in the way powerful street figures become known, admired by some, feared by others, envied by men who wished they had a fraction of his style or his courage. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't wild. He was disciplined in a way that made him even more dangerous. His businesses ran smooth. His associates respected him. His enemies chose their words carefully. His clothes never wrinkled. His voice rarely rose. And his chin never dipped. Men like that don't go looking for fights. They expect the world to give them a wide berth. But on Christmas Eve in 1895, the world stepped right into his path. And here's the part folks never talk about when they tell the Stagger Lee story. That night didn't just pit two men against each other. It pitted two kinds of pride against one another. Billy Lyons was a respected man, not flashy like Stag, not rich, but known and liked. He was a husband, a father, a hard worker. And in a moment of drunken foolishness or misguided bravado, he stepped across a line without realizing how thin it was. That saloon wasn't just a room full of noise. It was a stage where reputations lived or died. And Stag Lee's entire identity was wrapped up in how he carried himself in public. If a man snatched his hat and got away with it, that hat wasn't all he'd lose. He'd lose every ounce of respect he'd earned in a world that demanded he fight for every scrap of it. And maybe that's the saddest part of this whole story, two men caught in a moment the world wouldn't let them walk back from. So as you picture Stag Lee in that bar room, standing tall, shoulders squared, eyes steady, you've got to understand he wasn't some senseless killer waiting for an excuse. He was a man forged by a hard era, a man expected to defend his dignity at all costs. And on that winter night, with whiskey in the air and pride riding heavy on both their backs, the stage was set for something terrible. The story doesn't make sense unless you understand who Stag was, how he lived, how he moved, how he built a legend without ever meaning to. Because in the next section, when the argument breaks, when the hat is snatched, and the world holds its breath, you'll see that the song didn't turn Lee Shelton into Stagger Lee. The man turned himself into one long before the first note was ever sung. Come in close again, friends, because this part of the tale don't move quick. It moves slow and heavy, like a storm drifting in from the river, thick with the kind of tension you can feel long before the thunder rolls. I want you sitting here with me in that saloon on Christmas Eve, breathing the same smoky air, hearing the same cracking laughter, feeling the same temperature drop when two men who should have never crossed each other finally did, because this is where the fuse met the flame, where pride pushed past reason, and where the world decided it was done holding its breath. Now earlier I told you that St. Louis wasn't the polished, church-going city folks imagine when they read old newspaper clippings. Back in the 1,890 seconds, it was a place built on grit, sweat, and the kind of nighttime dealings polite society pretended didn't exist. Streets were lit by flickering gas lamps that barely cut through the dark. Snow lingered in dirty piles along the curbs. And down in the Ninth Ward, just far enough from the respectable parts of town, sat the kind of saloons that swallowed men whole. Bill Curtis's saloon was one of those places. A long, narrow room, warmed by a potbelly stove near the entrance, with walls stained yellow from years of cigarette smoke. The bar was heavy oak, polished only where elbows rubbed it smooth. Behind it stood rows of cheap whiskey that burned a man's throat clean and warm, with a piano pushed against the corner that only played when somebody had coin enough to keep the player awake. The floorboards creaked, the chairs wobbled, and the whole place smelled of wood smoke, sweat, river mud, and bad decisions. But on that particular Christmas Eve, there was something else drifting through the air, holiday cheer, mixed with that quiet kind of bitterness men hide under jokes and half-finished drinks. Whiskey tends to loosen tongues, and on holidays, it strips them bare. Folks drank to remember the good years, and they drank to forget the bad ones. And on a cold Missouri night, that saloon filled up early with men seeking warmth, companionship, and maybe just enough liquor to quiet the ghosts they carried around. Billy Lyons was already inside when the night took its first turn. He wasn't a troublemaker by nature, but he wasn't a man to back down either. He had steady work, a family waiting at home, and enough backbone to keep his head high even among men who made a living pushing others low. Folks respected him for his honesty and his straightforward way of speaking. He wasn't wealthy, he wasn't famous, but he was solid, anchored, reliable, the kind of man who didn't start fights for sport. But that night, he'd been drinking. Not enough to lose himself, but enough to warm the edges of his temper, enough to make him feel lighter, looser, and maybe a little too bold. When Lee Shelton stepped inside the saloon, the energy in the room changed, like someone had leaned down and blew out a candle. Men straightened up, eyes shifted. A path seemed to open without anyone saying a word. Stagg didn't demand attention, he earned it simply by existing. He took off his coat with deliberate care, brushed snow from his shoulders, and placed his famous Stetson hat neatly onto the counter beside him. The hat wasn't gaudy, it wasn't oversized. It was elegant, expensive, trimmed with a small stag's head emblem that glinted in the lamplight. Dirty boots and patched coats shared that barroom with him, but Stagg looked like he belonged to an entirely different world. Not rich in the white man's city sense, but rich in presence, in confidence, in that rare power some men carry in their posture. He ordered a drink steady-handed, slow-voiced, and the bartender poured it with more care than he gave anyone else's. Men nearby tried not to stare, but they did. Billy noticed, too. Maybe he'd had a long week at work. Maybe the cold kept him tense. Maybe he was trying to impress the men he'd been drinking with. Or maybe Stagg just carried the kind of energy that rubbed the wrong way against other men's insecurities. Whatever the reason, something in Billy stirred when Shelton entered. And trouble, real trouble, often begins with a stirred man trying to hide his own discomfort. The first words between them weren't harsh. Folks later said the conversation started polite enough. A nod, a greeting, maybe even a shared comment about the weather or the crowd. But drinking makes the world tilt, and pride makes it spin. Billy said something about politics, Stagg's political connections. Especially, Stagg responded, smooth, measured, with the kind of careful tone that sounds polite but carries an edge. Billy shot back louder. Stagg leaned in close enough to remind him he wasn't the kind of man you raised your voice at. Other men shifted uncomfortably. knowing how these exchanges could shift into something sharp in a heartbeat. Then it happened. Billy reached forward, quick but clumsy with drink, and grabbed Stag's hat off the counter. A hat he had no right to touch. Some men in the room swore Billy was only joking. Others swore he meant it as an insult. But the truth is this: the reason doesn't matter when the act itself crosses a sacred line. In those days, a black man's hat wasn't just an accessory. It was pride, identity, dignity stitched into cloth. Taking it wasn't just disrespect, it was domination. It was telling every man in that room that Stag could be belittled. Billy lifted the hat, grinned, and made some remark that no two witnesses ever agreed on. Some said he claimed he'd take the hat home. Some said he teased Stag about being too fancy. Others said he held it up like a trophy. None of it matters. What matters is that Stag's face hardened into something cold. Not surprised. Not angry in the explosive sense. Just cold. A stillness settled around him like winter ice forming over a pond. He told Billy to give it back. Not loud, not aggressive, just firm. Billy refused. The refusal hit the room harder than any punch could have. Men stopped talking. The piano keys went silent. Conversations froze mid-sentence. Even the bartender paused with a half-wiped glass in his hand, because everyone in that room, every single man, understood what had just happened. Billy Lyons had stepped across a man's dignity. And Lee Shelton wasn't the kind of man who stepped back to make peace. Billy might have realized too late what he'd done. He might have tried to play it off, laugh, or downplay the challenge he'd just sparked. But pride is a stubborn thing, especially when alcohol's pushing it from behind. Instead of backing down, he tightened his grip on the hat, and there it was, the point of no return. 2 men, 1 hat, 1 room slowly sinking into dread. Not because anyone wanted violence, but because everyone knew it was already coming. Stag rose from his seat with a calm so absolute it chilled the air around him. His hand moved slow, deliberate, down to his waistcoat, and for the first and last time that night, fear crawled up Billy Lyons' spine. But by then, the world had already decided what kind of story it wanted to tell. Stag's eyes settled on Billy with a heaviness that made several men look away. Billy opened his mouth to say something, maybe an apology, maybe another joke, maybe a plea, but the words never came. Because in that moment, the legend stepped forward and the man stepped back. This was the moment the myth was born. This was where the devil leaned in to listen. This was the breath before the gunshot that would echo for more than a century. And this was the final heartbeat before both men crossed a threshold neither of them could walk back across again. Pull your chair up close again, friends, because this is the part of the story where the lights dim, the crowd falls silent, and time itself seems to lean in just to listen. Every legend has a heartbeat the exact moment it stops being a simple memory and turns itself into something bigger, meaner, and more permanent. For Stagger Lee, that moment happened in a smoky St. Louis saloon, under a single oil lamp, with 2 men staring each other down over a hat that carried more weight than any crown. Now I want you to picture it clear, as if you were standing right there beside that potbelly stove, feeling the heat on your shins and the cold air at your back as someone opened the door and let winter drift inside. I want you to smell the whiskey hanging bitter in the air, the sweat of men who worked hard and lived hard, and the faint note of tobacco rising from the pipes glowing red in the corners. I want you to hear the creak of floorboards, the soft shuffle of boots, the distant sound of sleigh bells outside carried in by the wind. Because when the room froze, not in fear at first, but in recognition, it wasn't just another barroom argument. Men in that time and place understood instinctively when the air turned dangerous, when pride had snapped its leash and the moment had become something no reasonable voice could call back. That's the kind of tension that makes a room stand straighter than a church pew. Billy Lyons still had the hat in his hand when the world narrowed down to him and Stag standing a few feet apart, breaths frosting the air between them. Some men claimed he looked regretful. Others swore he still held that crooked grin of a man who didn't yet realize how close to the edge he was standing. But all accounts agree on one thing. His hand tightened around that hat, and the gesture set the tone of the night. Stag didn't shout, didn't curse, didn't lunge or stumble in drunken impulse. He rose from his seat slow as a man getting up from a sermon, shoulders high, chin steady, eyes sharp enough to cut the lamplight. His coat parted just slightly, enough for the room to glimpse the glint of metal tucked against his waist. And that was the moment, the exact heartbeat, when half the room wished they could slip out the door and pretend they hadn't come. Some claimed later that Stagg said something quiet, a final warning, a last offer for Billy to return the hat and end the night in peace. Others said he spoke nothing at all, just stared at Billy with a cold patience that rattled the back of men's teeth. But whether he spoke or not doesn't matter. What matters is that the message was clear as a shotgun blast. Give the hat back, or pay for it. Billy didn't give it back. Instead, he lifted it higher for the room to see, maybe to save face, maybe to claim some kind of victory in front of men who would carry the tale beyond the night. Pride is a dangerous river. It carries men faster than they realize. And by the time they understand the current, it's too late to swim against it. Billy opened his mouth to speak, maybe to laugh, maybe to taunt, maybe to offer some half-hearted apology, but his voice never made it into the world, because Stagg's hand moved first, not fast, not reckless. Slow, deliberate, deadly sure. His fingers wrapped around the handle of his .44 Smith & Wesson, the metal cold from the winter air seeping into the saloon each time the door cracked open. That gun had seen action before. This wasn't a man carrying a firearm as ornament. It was an extension of his will, a tool he had no fear of using when the world demanded he defend the dignity he'd spent a lifetime building. Billy's eyes widened, not in shock, but in realization. All the breath seemed to leave him, like the world suddenly stole his air and left him standing hollow. Some witnesses later swore they heard Billy say something soft under his breath, like a man praying or pleading. Others said their ears were ringing so loud with adrenaline, they couldn't have heard thunder if it struck the building. But one thing was certain. When Billy Lyons took that half-step backward, the world decided his fate for him. Stagg's gun came up, not with a flourish, not with drama, but with the terrifying calm of a man who had crossed a threshold inside himself and left the softer parts behind. And then there was the sound. A gunshot indoors is not like in the movies. It doesn't echo beautifully. It erupts. It tears through air and bone and wood and silence like the devil himself, splitting the room open. The .44 roared with a violence that shook dust from the rafters, and the flame from the muzzle painted the walls orange for the briefest, brightest second. Billy Lyons jerked backward as the bullet struck him in the gut. Not the chest, not the head, the gut. The kind of shot that doesn't kill quick, the kind that sinks a man slowly into himself. His hands dropped. The hat hit the floorboards with a soft whisper, landing upside down like a fallen crown stripped of its power. Billy's knees buckled, his breath hitched, sharp and broken, as he clutched the wound spreading warm across his shirt. The room erupted in gasps, shouts, and the frantic shuffle of men pushing back from their tables. A few scrambled to help Billy. Others stumbled toward the door. But no one touched Stagg, not a single soul, because Stagg stood there still as iron, gun pointed downward now, as if making peace with the ground beneath his boots. His face didn't twist in anger or regret. It held a grim, chilling clarity, the kind a man gains when he's committed to the path he's chosen. Even if it's paved in blood. Billy collapsed into the arms of another patron, mumbling something that no one could quite catch. Some say he asked for help. Others say he cried out for his family. A few claimed he whispered Stagg's name like a man trying to understand his own ending. But no matter what words passed his lips in those last moments of consciousness, the truth is this: Billy Lyons died because he touched the wrong man's pride. That's the part of the story most folks don't know. He didn't scramble for the back door. He didn't hide behind the bar or flee into the snow-covered streets. He stepped forward with the slow, composed walk of a man leaving church after being the last to pray. He bent down, picked up his hat, dusted off a trace of spilled whiskey, and placed it back on his head with a calmness that made the entire room feel colder. Then he walked out. Just like that. He walked out into the Christmas Eve night, into the falling snow, into the murmuring shock of men who'd witnessed something they'd tell and retell so many times that truth and myth would intertwine like threads in a rope. And according to some, as he pushed the saloon door open, he spoke only a few words, not shouted, not growled, just spoken, with the gravity of a man stating a fact deeper than regret. He shouldn't have taken my hat. Outside, the night waited for him, quiet, indifferent, almost respectful. The snow muffled his footsteps until they vanished entirely. Inside, men looked at one another with faces pale as morning fog, because they knew what had just happened was not just murder, it was the birth of a legend. From that moment on, Lee Shelton was no longer just Stag Lee, the well-dressed, political man, the respected and feared figure of St. Louis. He was something else. He was the man who shot another over pride and walked away without haste or fear. He was the man whose story would be sung by riverboat musicians, whispered by gamblers, and recorded by bluesmen until the tale took on a life older and darker than the truth itself. And that truth? It started here, with a hat on a floor, a man bleeding out, and another walking into the night wearing a crown made of violence. Pull your chair close again, friends, because after that gunshot cracked open the night, the story didn't end, it just changed clothes. A single bullet may have dropped Billy Lyons to the floor of that saloon, but the legend that rose up around it started moving long before the law ever laid hands on Stag Lee. Some men die and fade quick. Others die and spread like river water, filling every hollow, every whisper, every corner of the American imagination. Billy Lyons belonged to that second group. And Stag? Well, Stag stepped into a different kind of afterlife altogether, the kind reserved for men whose names grow sharper than their deeds. Now, first thing you need to understand is this. Stag didn't run. Never did. After he picked up his hat and stepped into the cold Christmas Eve night, he didn't hide under bedclothes or slip across state lines. He walked home at a steady pace, boots crunching snow, breath clouding out ahead of him like a man who'd just finished a day's work, not like someone who'd shot another man dead in front of 20 witnesses. In Stag's mind, he hadn't committed murder. He'd defended his dignity. In a world that denied black men every shred of respect, he believed he'd done what any man of pride had a right to do. And that mindset, that deep, immovable belief set the tone for everything that came next. Billy Lyons didn't die right away. Gut wounds are cruel that way. They linger. They make a man fade slow, inch by inch, breath by breath. His friends carried him into the street, calling for help, shouting his name. Someone ran for a doctor. Someone else ran for the police. But Stag didn't look back, not once. And the city, already hardened by years of violence and inequality, shivered under the knowledge that a reckoning was coming. The news traveled faster than the snowstorm rolling down the river. St. Louis lit with rumors before dawn. Some said Stag had shot Billy twice. Others said he'd pistol-whipped him first. Some swore Billy had begged for his life. Others insisted Stag had smiled when he fired. The truth wasn't enough for folks. They needed the tale to carry weight, to match the size of the men involved. And once the lines between fact and exaggeration blur, they never unblur again. Police arrested Stag the next afternoon. He didn't resist, didn't argue, didn't even deny it. He handed over his gun, stepped into the back of the wagon, and rode to the station with the calmness of a man, attending his own coronation. Officers said he held his shoulders square, eyes forward, hat still perched neat on his head like a crown that no man could knock loose. Inside the jail, men whispered when he passed. Even the guards looked uneasy. Stag wasn't the biggest man in the room, but he was the surest. And that kind of confidence unsettles people, especially when it comes wrapped in a reputation sharp enough to draw blood. The papers seized the story like vultures circling a carcass. Headlines painted Stag as a brute, a demon, the wickedest man in St. Louis. They printed sketches of him with exaggerated scowls and wild eyes. Though anyone who'd seen him knew he rarely raised his voice, much less his expression. That's the trick. Newspapers learned early: fear sells better than accuracy, and Stag made the perfect monster for the city to rally against. But the black community saw him differently. Some admired his fearlessness, some envied his power, some condemned him, but even they spoke his name with caution. In neighborhoods where dignity was often the only possession a man had, Stag's refusal to surrender his pride became the stuff of quiet legend. Now, the trial. It came quick. Billy died a few days later, and the case became unavoidable. Prosecutors painted Stag as a ruthless pimp, a criminal kingpin who executed an innocent man over nothing more than a hat. They made Billy a martyr, a family man torn down by the wicked heart of a violent man. And to be fair, Billy had a family who grieved him deeply. He wasn't a villain. He wasn't trying to start a war. He was a man who made a mistake, a fatal one, but a mistake all the same. Stagg's defense didn't stand much chance, not because the facts were stacked against him, but because the city had already decided the verdict. A black man killing another black man might not have stirred much outrage in the streets, but a powerful black man killing a respected one set off alarms inside the political circles that feared men like Stagg more than any outlaw lurking in the alleys. In that courtroom, Stagg didn't tremble, didn't apologize, didn't plead. He sat upright in a suit that fit like it had been stitched onto him, hat resting neatly on his knee, eyes fixed on the judge with the same unshakable composure he carried the night of the murder. To the jurors, it came off as arrogance. To Stagg, it was survival. He was convicted, of course, sentenced to prison. But the legend didn't stop, it stretched. It grew. It started worming its way into the songs sung around barrel house pianos. Musicians retold the murder in rhythm and rhyme. Some exaggerated Stagg's ruthlessness, others turned him into a folk hero. The truth belonged to the archives, but the myth belonged to the people. And then, like a twist written by fate, something strange happened. Stagg was pardoned. A few years into his sentence, political changes, connections, and the churn of the justice system cracked. The prison doors opened for him. He walked free again, not as a reformed man, not as a humbled one, but as someone who believed he'd stared down the law and won. For a brief moment, he tasted freedom. But men like Stagg don't reinvent themselves. They return to the world that molded them, and that world was already shifting. His influence wasn't what it had been. Younger men were stepping into the roles he once commanded. Times were changing, and Stagg didn't change with them. Then came the second killing, another dispute, another flash of temper, another gun, another man dead. This time the law didn't offer mercy. They snatched him up with twice the force and 3 times the fear. The newspapers tore into him like wolves. Community leaders distanced themselves. The city breathed easier once he was behind bars for good. He would die in that prison, old, sick, far from the saloons where his legend was born. But here's the twist. Prison didn't bury him. It crowned him. Because while Shelton died, Stagger Lee lived. Men in prison yards told the story like an epic. Blues musicians turned it into a morality tale, stamped with sin and swagger. Gamblers repeated it around tables thick with cigarette smoke. Preachers used it as warning. Children heard the name and felt a shiver of awe. And somewhere along the line, the man became myth, the myth became music, and the music became immortal. The truth of the night Billy Lyons fell, faded behind verses and variations, behind riffs and rhythms, behind each new performance that stretched the facts a little further. Stagg became the devil. Stagg became vengeance. Stagg became the very embodiment of pride carried too far to turn back. And all of that, the myth, the power, the music, was born from the trial that attempted to bury him. Funny how justice sometimes works in reverse. Come on back in close, friends, because once Stagg Lee left the courtroom in chains, the story most folks think they know hasn't even begun yet. Everything up till now has been fact, records, witnesses, and the cold turn of justice. But what comes next is the part of the tale that slipped free from the newspapers and crawled into the smoky corners of America's music halls, riverboats, back porches, and bar rooms. It's the part where the truth loosened its collar, leaned back, and let the legend walk in, wearing Stagg's hat like a crown. You see, stories don't stay still. A good one gets restless. It moves from mouth to mouth, town to town, picking up pieces of the teller along the way. And the murder of Billy Lyons by Shelton was a story so sharp, so simple in shape but deep in meaning, that it didn't take long for it to become something else entirely. It stopped being about St. Louis, stopped being about Christmas Eve, stopped being about 2 men whose pride collided in the worst way. It became a symbol, a parable, a tune carried by men who knew struggle and danger as well as they knew the sound of their own footsteps. The first people to breathe new life into the tale were the prisoners, men working the fields under the watchful eyes of guards who never blinked. Those chain gangs passed songs between them like spirituals, working chants, call and response, hymns of survival. and before long, the name Stagger Lee started showing up in their verses. At first, it was simple. A mention here, a line there. But as the song traveled, it began to stretch, growing taller, darker, louder. The version you and I might recognize today didn't start on a record. It started under a beating sun, with men dragging hammers and shovels through the dirt, singing to keep their minds from breaking. They poured all the things they couldn't say, all the rage they couldn't show, all the fear they had to swallow, straight into the story of a man who refused to bow to anyone, not even the law. Slowly, the song drifted off the prison farms and onto riverboats moving up and down the Mississippi. Deckhands hummed it while hauling crates. Fishermen sang it under their breath at dawn. Gamblers used it to drown out the tension at the card table. And every time the tale crossed another county line, it picked up a new layer of myth. In some versions, Stagg shot Billy because he cheated at cards. In others, Billy insulted Stagg's woman. And in many, many retellings, the hat becomes wholly an object so tied to Stagg's identity that to touch it was to invite damnation. Musicians added verses where Stagg didn't just avenge himself. He punished. He conquered. He strode into danger, smiling. There were men in those days who had lost everything: work, land, family, and singing about a man who took what he was owed by force felt like breathing fire after a lifetime of swallowing ashes. Stagg became something bigger than his own story, because he represented the one thing the times denied: black men, unbreakable pride. By the time the 1,910 seconds rolled around, folk musicians across the South knew the ballad. None of them sang the same version. Some made Stagg a hero. Others made him the devil. But every one of them sang with the same raw electricity, the same sense that they were passing along a truth more important than accuracy. It wasn't until the 1,920 seconds that the song got captured on a record. And here's where the legend really started its long, winding climb. When Mississippi John Hurt sat with his guitar and let that soft, ghost-like voice fall across the microphone, the world heard something different. He didn't growl the tale. He didn't shout it. He whispered it with the calm of a man talking about something inevitable. His version made Stagg feel like a shadow moving across a winter road, quiet, unstoppable, cold as a blade. The gentleness of the melody made the violence underneath feel even sharper, like a knife wrapped in silk. But bluesmen, being who they were, storytellers, exaggerators, preachers of rhythm, they started pushing the myth further. In juke joints thick, with smoke, singers made Stagg into something no ordinary man could stand against. They said he walked into the bar smiling like a wolf. They said the devil himself stepped aside when Stagg came through. They said Billy begged, but Stagg didn't blink. They said you could still hear the gunshot if you listened in the right alley after midnight. Some songs claimed Stagg's bullet never cooled. Others said Billy's spirit still tried to flee, but Stagg dragged it back down just by speaking his name. There were versions where the sheriff tried to arrest him and Stagg laughed, strode past him, and didn't leave footprints. Versions where Stagg told the judge to take note of his name because hell would be looking for him soon enough. And there's one version, sung on back porches by men who swore they saw things they refused to explain, where Stagger Lee dies and marches right down into hell, throws open the gates, knocks the devil off his throne, and crowns himself king. Folks didn't sing that because they believed the story literally. They sang it because a man like Stagg represented a deep, unspoken truth, one the world wasn't ready to say out loud. He was the embodiment of resistance, the avatar of a pride so fierce it refused to be caged, even by infernal fire. In a world built to break black men, the blues built one who could not be broken. People sometimes ask why the song spread so wide when plenty of other crimes from that era got forgotten. But music doesn't cling to the facts. It clings to the feeling underneath them. And that feeling, the rage, the dignity, the defiance, was something black America understood deep in its bones. They sang Stagg not because he was right, but because he was unafraid. The Great Migration carried the song north. Men moving to Chicago, steel mills, and Detroit car plants brought it with them like luggage that couldn't be left behind. They played it in kitchens, at house parties, in clubs where the ceilings dripped heat and the walls vibrated with the pulse of a world reinventing itself. And every new city changed Stagg a little more. In some places he became a gangster. In others, he became a prophet of violence. In others, he became a warning, a man who went too far and paid the price. But through it all, the legend grew and grew until there was no separating the myth from the music. By the time the 1950s rolled around, the story had already traveled half a century, and that's when the world outside the blues finally got its first real taste. That's when rock and roll grabbed Stag by the collar and dragged him into the spotlight with a heat America couldn't ignore. And that's where the legend takes its next sharp turn, where radio stations balked, where singers cleaned up the murder to make it palatable, and where the sanitized version only made the real story burn hotter underground. Ease on in close again, friends, because the story's about to take a turn into a time when America was trying real hard to pretend it had outgrown its shadows. The 1950s were a strange mix of shiny promises and deep cracks in the pavement. Folks were buying new cars, painting white picket fences, and watching television sets glow like blue fire in their living rooms. But underneath all that polish, the country was trembling with tension, race, class, Cold War fears, and a growing music revolution no preacher or politician could hold back. And it was right in the middle of that trembling that the legend of Stagger Lee came roaring back to life louder than ever. See, by the time the 50s arrived, Stag had been wandering through the American songbook for half a century. He lived in blues clubs, in jukebox corners, in the humming memories of men who'd worked the rivers and the railroads. But he hadn't yet crossed into the mainstream, hadn't yet stepped into the spotlight where America couldn't look away. That job fell to a man named Lloyd Price, a singer from Kenner, Louisiana, whose voice carried the clean force of gospel and the rough edge of Saturday night living. When Price stepped into the studio in 1958 to record his version of the old folk song, he probably didn't know he was about to light a fire that would stretch coast to coast. His arrangement was bright, brassy, irresistible. The drums thumped, the horns soared, his voice danced across the melody. And in the middle of all that joy, there it was, the murder, the hat, the gunshot, the showdown between Stagger Lee and Billy Lyons. But this time, the story didn't lurk in shadows. It strutted, it grinned, it demanded to be heard. The song rolled off the presses and onto radios with such force that it started climbing the charts almost immediately. People who'd never heard the name Stagger Lee in their lives suddenly found themselves humming about a cold-blooded killer while stirring their morning coffee. And Lord, did that make America nervous. Radio stations from the Bible Belt to the Northeast lit up with complaints. Moral watchdog groups declared the song dangerous, saying it glorified violence. Some stations refused to play it entirely, claiming it was too raw for family listening. The idea of a black man killing another black man over something as symbolic as a hat unsettled people far more than they admitted. But one thing was certain. The song was too big to stop. The more stations banned it, the more people demanded it. The more preachers condemned it, the more teenagers went searching for it. The legend, already larger than life, exploded. And that's when censorship stepped in. See, the powers that be didn't want to ban Lloyd Price entirely. They wanted to clean him up. So they brought him back into the studio and told him to change the lyrics. No murder, no gun, no barroom showdown. Just a harmless disagreement between two men over a woman at a dance. Something the public could swallow without choking. That's how the clean version was born. In the Bowdlerized rewrite, Stagger Lee isn't a killer. He's just a man trying to win back his girl. Billy isn't a dead man. He's just a rival. The whole thing plays out like a schoolyard spat instead of a violent, irreversible act that shook an entire community decades earlier. Now normally, when a record label forces an artist to change a song, the new version becomes the official one, and the original fades into obscurity. But not this time. Not with Stag. Something wild happened. The sanitized version didn't replace the real one. It amplified it. Suddenly, two worlds existed side by side, the polished world of radio programmers and the gritty world of people who knew the truth. And the contrast made Stagger Lee feel even more dangerous, more forbidden, more thrilling. Kids snuck into record stores asking for the real one. Dancers in clubs demanded DJs spin the Outlaw version, not the watered-down edit. Musicians leaned into the darker lyrics during live performances because the crowd cheered louder when the gunshot made its return. It was as if Stagg had muscled his way through the front door of white America, and no amount of scrubbing could get him to behave. The raw power of that outlaw spirit was too strong, too real, too honest. And that honesty was what scared people most. Because here's the thing the censors never understood. The story of Stagger Lee wasn't about a murder. It was about fury, pride, identity, consequences, things that lived deep in America's bones. The clean version tried to strip away the grit, but in doing so, it highlighted exactly what the legend was meant to carry, so the songs kept spreading. Versions multiplied. Performers twisted the tale into new shapes. Some turned it into comedy. Others made it horror. But the core remained a man who could not be tamed by law, morality, or censorship. In the years that followed, Stagger Lee marched into rock and roll. Bob Dylan sang him. The Grateful Dead stretched him across stage jams until he felt like a cosmic outlaw drifting through the speakers. Wilson Pickett turned him into a dance floor storm. Dr. John gave him a New Orleans voodoo soul. And in each retelling, the legend grew a new set of teeth. Some musicians leaned into the darkness, making Stagg so cruel and unstoppable he bordered on mythic evil. Others softened him, turning him into a misunderstood anti-hero. But the most powerful versions, those that lasted, kept him mean and unrepentant, kept him cold, kept him proud, kept him marching forward with the same force that made him lift his hat off that saloon floor back in 1895 and walk out into the winter night without a single backward glance. By then, Stagger Lee wasn't just a song, and he wasn't just a murderer. He was the embodiment of a certain truth about America, one the country didn't want to look at directly. He was the shadow behind the jukebox glow, the ghost sitting in the back booth of every bar. The reminder that the line between pride and violence is razor thin, and that once crossed, it's nearly impossible to return from. He became a symbol of unstoppable will in a world built to crush it. A man who stood his ground even when standing meant destruction. A figure carried not by newspapers or lawmen, but by rhythm, rhyme, and a melody that refused to die. And in the end, the censors never stood a chance. You can't clean up a legend. You can't rewrite a myth into politeness. You can't turn a monster into a puppy just because you want the world to look less frightening. Stagger Lee roared through the airwaves, through the decades, through the divides of race and class, and made himself permanent. Every version that tried to weaken him only fed the darker, truer one underneath. And by the time the world reached the last decades of the 20th century, people weren't asking who Stagger Lee was. They were asking what he meant. Ease on and a little closer now, friends, because we've walked a long road together through this story. From a cold St. Louis saloon to the riverbanks of the blues, through the polished floors of 1950s recording studios, and into the restless heart of American folklore. And after all of it, after every version and variation and resurrection, there's one last question sitting heavy on the table between us. Like the last glass of whiskey a man pours before the night ends. Why does Stagger Lee still live? Why does his name refuse to quiet down? Why do musicians keep calling on him like an old spirit who never stops answering? Why do people hum about him in kitchens, whistle about him on back roads, tap his rhythm on steering wheels, and pass along his tale like a piece of inherited fire? To understand that, you've got to understand something old and deep about the South and about America itself. This country has always carried two shadows, one cast by hope and one cast by anger. Folks don't like to talk about that second one. They cover it up with flags and fireworks and speeches about good intentions. But that shadow is there, stretching long across the ground, reaching all the way back to a time when men were told to bow their heads and take whatever the world handed them with a forced smile. Stagger Lee walked out of that shadow. He didn't crawl. He didn't slink. He didn't ask permission. He stepped forward with that steady, terrifying certainty that made him larger than any life he could have lived on his own. To the poor, the angry, the weary, and the forgotten, he became a kind of dark mirror, a symbol of those parts of themselves they weren't allowed to express. Every man who ever clenched his fists and held his tongue because the world wouldn't let him speak his mind found a piece of himself in Stagg, not because Stagg was right, but because he was free in a way they could never be. And that's the secret of legends, the part you won't find written in any newspaper. A legend doesn't grow from facts. It grows from the emotions people pour into it, from the things they're scared to admit, from the truths they whisper but never dare shout. Stagger Lee wasn't adopted because he was a murderer. He was adopted because he represented a kind of fearlessness the world only tolerates in stories. Now, don't mistake me. I'm not here to paint Stag as a hero. A man died that night because pride rose higher than reason. Families mourned, lives changed. Billy Lyons wasn't a folk villain. He was a man with people who loved him. And Stag wasn't some righteous avenger. He was a man driven by ego, anger, maybe even insecurity beneath all that polished swagger. But legends aren't built on morality. They're built on tension, danger, contradiction. They live at the crossroads of what we fear and what we secretly admire. That crossroads is where Stagger Lee made his home. When blues musicians first pulled his name into songs, they didn't do it because they wanted to celebrate violence. They did it because the story held a kind of rhythm that matched their own lives. Men who had been pushed down, ignored, chewed up by farms, factories, railroads, and bosses heard something in Stag's tale that resonated like a plucked guitar string. They heard defiance. They heard refusal. They heard the one thing the world rarely gave them, a man who answered insult with power instead of silence. Stagger Lee became the symbol of a man who would not break even when every rule said he should. And when the song hit white America in the 50s, cloaked in horns and drums and Lloyd Price's slick voice, it carried that same current beneath the melody. Folks didn't know why it pulled at them. They just knew it did. Parents tried to ban it. Radio stations tried to clean it up. But the more they scrubbed, the more the real version stained the fabric of American culture. Censorship has a funny habit of making the forbidden shine brighter. Every attempt to soften the legend made the rough edges sharper in people's minds. And as the decades rolled on, the legend didn't fade, it multiplied. Every new artist who sang the song added their own scars to it. Bigger gun, deeper rage, thicker myth. By the time the 20th century closed its doors, Stagger Lee wasn't a man anymore. He was an archetype. You know the type, even if you think you don't. The unstoppable one, the unrepentant one. The force of nature wrapped in human skin. The man who would rather drag the world down with him than bow to it. You see him in westerns. You see him in gangster films. You see him in outlaw ballads from here to Ireland. You see him in the eyes of every fictional character who decides they've had enough and chooses violence instead of compromise. He's the quiet shadow behind every anti-hero America has ever loved. And yet, for all that, there's something else beneath the surface of his legend. Something tender, something sad. Because when you strip away the myth, you're left with a truth people don't talk about often enough. Stagger Lee wasn't created out of pure violence. He was created out of pain. The pain of living in a world where a black man had to defend his dignity at gunpoint just to get an ounce of respect. The pain of men who saw their fathers, brothers, and friends ground down by a society that treated them like second thoughts. The pain of living behind an invisible wall and knowing you'd never step over it without losing something essential. That pain poured into the ballads like water flooding into cracked earth. And from that soil, the legend grew tall. A myth is a body built to protect a wound. Stagger Lee was the wound America didn't want to admit was bleeding. So why does the legend live? Why does his name still echo in corners where the music runs low and the night feels older than it should? Maybe because America still hasn't healed the wound that made him. Maybe because people still recognize pieces of themselves in the story, anger they can't show, pride they can't express, battles they aren't allowed to fight. Maybe because even now, in a world lit by screens and satellites instead of gas lamps, folks still carry ancient frustrations under their ribs like hot coals. And when they hear that name, when they feel that rhythm, when they picture that hat falling to the saloon floor, they remember there was once a man who didn't swallow his fire. He let it burn. But there's another reason, too. One quieter, gentler, almost sacred in its own strange way. Legends like Stagger Lee survive because they teach us something. Even if the lesson is uncomfortable, they remind us of the cost of pride, of the danger in unchecked anger, of the way a single moment can break lives in half. They remind us that inside every man, no matter how polished or poised, there's a storm waiting to rise. And if you ignore it long enough, it will. So when I think about Stagger Lee these days, I don't picture the monster bluesman carved out of the murder. I don't picture the cold grin, the devil's swagger. the showdown that explodes in brass horns and sharp drum beats. I picture a man walking into a saloon on Christmas Eve, tired probably, proud definitely, not knowing that the next hour of his life would echo for more than a century. I picture two men shaped by their time, stumbling into tragedy together. I picture the way a small act, a snatched hat, can unleash something the world cannot contain. And I picture the long shadow that stepped out of that moment and never walked back in. Some legends die when the man dies. But others, well, others get carried like a tune that refuses to leave your head. They show up in new songs, new stories, new generations. They outlive their creators. They outlive their culture. They root themselves deep in the ground, where the truth becomes fertilizer for something larger, stranger, and more enduring. That's Stagger Lee. He's not just a character in a ballad. He's a reminder that the past doesn't stay buried. It walks, and if you listen real close, you can hear that walk even now. Somewhere out there in the long dark, between truth and myth, a man puts on a hat, straightens his coat, and steps into the room like the world is his to claim. Some names fade when the music stops. Stagger Lee never did.